Yeah, I guess let's get started. My name's Tamara Frankel. I'm a founding partner at D1 Ventures, co-founder of Polka House. I gave a talk earlier in the morning, so you all probably saw me there as well. Yeah, I think maybe like the easiest way to get this started is to basically just go panelist by panelist and everyone introduce themselves and their project.
Hi everyone, I'm Luke Youngblood from Moonwell. We are a decentralized lending and borrowing protocol on Moonbeam. I'm really excited to be here to talk about Polkadot DeFi today.
Harrison Comfort, work with DAM Finance, and we are an omni-chain stablecoin protocol.
Hey guys. Turn on. Hey guys. Sorry. Hey guys, this is Joe. I'm from AstridDAO, and we are building the decentralized stablecoin on Astar and for Polkadot. And we launched our token, we launched our stablecoin BAI, B-A-I, this April.
So yeah, I think let's just like jump right into probably something that's on the top of everyone's mind when they think about DeFi and Polkadot, which is bridge risk. We've had some large DeFi exploits in the ecosystem. And basically, what are all of you doing to eliminate bridge risk? And like, what are some types of like insurances, either like an insurance fund or relying on on-chain governance for chain rollbacks, like et cetera? Like, how do you mitigate this risk that we're all dependent on bridges?
It's a really great question. Sorry, I had to turn on. It's a really great question. So obviously, like the Nomad hack has heavily impacted the Polkadot ecosystem, Moonbeam especially, because like the largest user of Nomad bridged funds was basically Moonwell users and StellaSwap users on Moonbeam. So we were pretty heavily impacted. All of our user community suffered heavy losses from the Nomad hack. And it was pretty devastating because it happened right at the time when Moonbeam was in the middle of the Harvest Moon campaign. And so there are liquidity incentives helping bring TVL into the ecosystem. There were hundreds of millions of dollars of TVL that had just come into Moonbeam. And Polkadot DeFi was really just getting started. So it was a really devastating time. But going forward, what we've done as a community in Moonwell is we accelerated our launch of full on-chain governance because we knew we had to make some tough decisions as a community, like what to do with these Nomad asset markets on our protocol. How do we deprecate these markets in a safe way and in a decentralized way? We don't want to take centralized actions as a team. So we had to kind of, accelerate our launch of on-chain governance. And through on-chain governance, the community has now deprecated the Nomad markets, so they're no longer able to be used as collateral. And we are just supporting the native Polkadot assets that are on Moonwell. So that's cross-chain DOT coming from the Relay chain, Glimmer, which is the Moonbeam native token, and Frax, which is a native stablecoin. And then going forward as a community, we're going to start to vote on new bridged assets like Wormhole. Wormhole has now arrived, and Wormhole brings a better track record on security. I think they have a really strong team behind them at Jump Crypto, and they have really good investment. They have a $10 million bug bounty. So we're thinking of like the ways to kind of mitigate some of these risks are first use native Parachain assets. That's the best because we don't have any bridge risk from like XCM assets, right? And then second, as a community, select really high quality bridged assets that are coming from other ecosystems like Ethereum and Cosmos, based on like the security and track record and all of the characteristics of the bridge. Do they have the financial backing of someone like Jump Crypto behind them? Do they have an effective bug bounty program through Immunify? So we kind of think of it in those terms. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer, but
that's all right.
Thanks.
Do you guys have anything to add?
Yeah, I think plus one on what Luke said. I think like choosing the bridge is definitely, we need to look at the bridge track record, and we need to do a lot of research, and also adding the collaterals. For AstridDAO, like we are over-collateralized stablecoin, we issue over-collateralized stablecoin BAI, and we need to be very careful about listing collaterals on our protocol, right? And as Luke said, I think we should focus more on the Polkadot native assets when the XM bridge is enabled. It's safer and And this DOT has a lot of addressable market, and it's not fully utilized yet. And
So for us, the primary objective of our protocol is to ensure that the stablecoin remains solvent. So in the context of bridges, what that means is we assume that it's only a matter of time before they're going to fail. So we've built our protocol with detective and preventative measures in place such that we can really mitigate that risk. And that manifests itself in 4 ways. The first is when you mint D prime, the same of our stablecoin, on Ethereum and you teleport it over, we use the word teleport very deliberately. It's not a deposit and issuance of wrapped asset model. It's a mint and burn model. And what that translates to is that D prime becomes a native asset on Polkadot. It's just an accounting adjustment in the protocol. The next thing that we've done, again, assuming that one of these cross-chain protocols is going to have a problem, is that we've modularized them such that if any one of them has an issue, there's an opportunity to disable the adapter and fail over to a second one. So we really want to be modular with regards to supporting more than one in the event that one has a problem. Then the third issue, we've introduced a primitive called the Guardian, which because of the mint and burn nature of the way we're teleporting D prime from Ethereum to the .sama ecosystem in Moonbeam, there's a real-time log of every mint and burn action, and we do that by scanning the mempools. And anytime there's an inconsistency, the protocol immediately halts. So as a team, we have an opportunity to see has something nefarious taken place. In the event that it has, there's an opportunity in connection with the protocol to vote on burning any ill-advised issuance of the D prime token.
Great, guys. So my next question is a little bit more of both a question and kind of getting everyone's imagination of how they see this future. But basically, what does Axiom-powered DeFi look like to you? How is your project positioning itself to be part of the Axiom composability stack? And what does even Axiom composability look like in this multi-chain ecosystem? I think something really powerful about Ethereum DeFi was the tight composability, that all of the projects could reuse like parts of other projects and the assets within them. And now here we have this like fractured, sharded ecosystem. And so what does this new paradigm of composability look like?
So this is a great question too. First of all, the thing that really appealed to us about .sama in general is just the fact that we can bring in the best parachain assets from all the parachains into our lending protocol. So for a money markets protocol like Moonwell, it really gives us a huge benefit in that we don't necessarily, it's sort of like you said, the early days of Ethereum when everyone was on mainnet, there wasn't like these fractured EVM L1s everywhere. Like all of the protocols could kind of build on top of each other like Lego blocks. And so we can bring the liquidity from the best parachain assets into Moonwell. And we don't have to deploy, like 20 forks on 20 different L1s, which is really appealing. And then the other thing that is more of a longer term thing that we're going to start seeing, I think, is this connected contracts use case where I can send messages from one parachain to a contract on another. And I think one of the first big applications you're going to see is like cross parachain governance. So like protocols that are like accessible on multiple parachains will probably use message passing to send governance messages. Like I could vote on Moonbeam, but my vote can actually like take effect on some other parachain, right? So I think that's going to be a killer use case because it means we can reuse all the DAO tooling from Ethereum, which is actually quite good compared to like some of the DAO tooling on Substrate, to be honest. So I think just having that ability to do like pass messages between contracts is going to be really key for long-term success.
Cool. Do you guys have any?
It's definitely around being able to support collateral from different parachains. And that's one of the reasons why we were keen to deploy on Moonbeam was because they are building these connectors to other parachains. But I also think what's really compelling, and Joe and I were just chatting about this before, is this notion of being able to use collateral from different parachains to mint our stablecoin, and the really interesting kind of arbitrage opportunities that can kind of manifest in that regard. And it really helps sort of accelerate the flywheel of just general liquidity and utilization across the entire ecosystem.
Yeah, a plus one on what Harrison just mentioned. I think for us, AstridDAO has a very unique mechanism. So it has super high capital efficiency. Say if you have like $100 worth of BTC, you can mint like 92 worth of like stable coin in our protocol. And it's super safe, right? Right now, like we've been through like the black swans and our stable coin stability is being battle tested. And for us, I think we are positioning AstridDAO and Buy as the liquidity engine for the Polkadot ecosystem. And yeah, with the Parachain's assets, we're gonna mint more and more buy and then drive the DeFi ecosystem for the Polkadot.
All right, so I guess, okay, let's move on to our next question. Just basically, how can DeFi projects leverage Substrate and this Polkadot native technology beyond the EVM? You know, like there was so much promise of all the different things you can do with this technology, like parallelization, like ink smart contracts, et cetera. And right now we're really basically just seeing EVM DeFi. And so what do you guys think?
So we're operating pretty much at the EVM layer. We don't do a lot at the substrate layer, so we're basically like a dApp deployed on top of Moonbeam. But we have been taking advantage of some of the pretty cool features that Moonbeam has, for example, like Rust precompiles. So there's functionality that exists that it looks just like a smart contract, but you're actually like executing Rust code on Substrate behind the scenes. So for example, one feature we added to our front end app recently was the ability to do batch operations. So like when I'm unfolding a leveraged borrowing position, normally that might take you like 10 transactions, depending on how much leverage you have. You have to like kind of repay some of your loan and then withdraw and kind of do this process over and over again. But we can use the batch precompile to actually send 30 operations at once in a single like Ethereum transaction, and they all get executed at once, which is something you could only do with a smart contract before. So it gave us like a tool we could actually use without having to deploy like custom smart contract and audit it. And I think like those Rust precompiles are pretty powerful, and we'll see more and more use cases that use those. Also, I think there's sort of like this underserved niche in cross consensus messaging, or XCM, right now, where like contracts need to be able to talk to each other on other parachains, but it's like the internet before there were firewalls everywhere, when like universities were just connected to the internet. And everyone trusts everyone, but like in this connected contracts world, there's no network layer like saying like, okay, it's cool to get a message from this app, but not from this app. And I think that's something that I'm excited to see teams build, because I think there's a lot of unexplored space there, that like a lot of opportunity to build like the networking routing layer for XCM.
Cool.
I'll go first. So as some of you guys might know, like AstridDAO is built on top of Astar, which supports both EVM and WASM, right, runtime. And for us, right now, we are still building on top of EVM, but we can leverage, and we're exploring actually utilizing some of the cool features from WASM side. And yeah, like what Luke mentioned, right, after XCM bridges enable, like there are more and more native assets flowing in, and yeah, there's a huge opportunity there.
Yeah, just adding the XE functionality to our stablecoin such that it can, migrate around the ecosystem. But what we're also really excited about is the convergence of the Kusama and Polkadot ecosystem, such that we can also use some assets from Kusama as well for collateralization purposes.
Yeah, that's a big one. We're waiting for XCM v3, because I think that's when like the Kusama relay chain and the Polkadot relay chain will sort of be able to pass messages between each other. So that's gonna be a big unlock, because right now we like have a protocol on Moonriver and we have a protocol on Moonbeam, and they can't really govern each other today because we can't pass messages between them, but in a secure way. But when we can, now we can kind of like unify governance between Kusama and Polkadot parachains, which is kind of cool.
Cool, guys. So I guess my next question is a more fun question, actually, of what each of you are doing to make DeFi in this ecosystem more exciting. As kind of like a veteran, I know what you're doing, Harrison, but like, as a veteran of DeFi summer, et cetera, beyond like, fundamentally like what these DeFi protocols were, there was also a huge amount of entertainment. Like we had fair launches, like really tight community cycles. It was like playing a global MMO with, and so basically, and I don't know, I've written kind of like a long form essay on this, like last spring, kind of like going through the story and iteration of DeFi from last bear market until like late 2021, early 2022, when a lot of this fell apart. And so, how do we bring back the fun?
This is also a really great question. I mean, for those of us that were around in DeFi summer in 2020, I mean, it was really fun. There was like a memification, all the food coins, like sushi and yam and everything that was going on, and like the fair launch of like Yearn. And there were all these kind of fun memes and stuff happening. the way, I don't know, the way I think we get back to there is, first of all, we need a bull market again. I mean, obviously that was a lot more fun when we were in a bull market than a bear. You tend to have more users and more like activity, which is great, you know, more liquidity. But also I think the future I see really is like gamification. You know, some of the early like GameFi projects like DeFi Kingdoms and stuff, and like figuring out fun ways to kind of like blend NFTs with DeFi, because I feel like NFTs are sort of like an offshoot of DeFi in a way that like all the DeFi OGs made too much money and had to start spending it on something. But I feel like gamification is really the key to like making things exciting again and like building some new stories and narratives.
Yeah, I think crypto massive adoption is definitely going to help DeFi, right? GameFi is one thing, SocialFi, all those like projects right now like trying to explore in the space. One thing I found is very, very interesting is like usually in those developing countries, like without very good financial infrastructures, like Argentina, like those countries, I think the people there have don't have the trust for the centralized government or banking systems because the inflation rate is so high and so on and so forth. And I think DeFi really has good opportunities in those countries. And yeah, I think yeah, that's why I'm starting to learn like Spanish. Yeah, we're gonna do more marketing in those places too. Yeah.
And if you haven't, you should definitely check out Tamara's essay on the D1 Ventures site regarding sort of the history of DeFi. It's amazing. But for us, having fun, making it exciting, it's really twofold. The first is, I think there's really an opportunity to introduce like philosophy into your project. So for us, we have one objective, and that's to bring TVL from Ethereum to .sama. So that's the entire purpose of our project. And then on the lighter side, we all love the Gotham universe. If you've ever checked out our Twitter, you know, we do quite a bit with the Joker. We just think that the Joker is such a cool character and it's such a cool universe because we kind of live in this age of crony capitalism. And in many ways, I feel like the Joker is this sort of like rebellious character. And we're all here in this space that kind of opens its arms up to all of us. And we just have a lot of fun creating content around that. So yeah, that's just like a kind of, it's an expression in terms of creativity that we just like to do for fun.
Totally. Yeah, I really appreciate that. I do believe that, you know, most of these projects can also be seen in the lens of art and bringing back the creativity. And also what you said was like very true in terms of like these NFT cycles coming after DeFi cycles, which very much so were like, you know, from people making money in DeFi and then like putting the ecosystem back into essentially the art of the ecosystem that they were operating into. And so, yeah, those cycles are really interesting to see, but yeah, it's important to keep it creative. So yeah, on a more serious note, I guess, like I just kind of wanted to go through with each of you and have you each describe your cross-chain strategy for your project.
So for us, first, our cross-chain strategy really started around like how do we bring the best liquidity from Ethereum mainnet and like from those DeFi OGs into Moonbeam and into .sama in general, and also you know, we have to kind of acknowledge that like there's a lot of excitement happening in the Cosmos ecosystem right now with some of the zones like Osmosis, and they're sort of starting to build shared security there. So like bringing the best assets from like Cosmos and Ethereum ecosystems has really been like our bread and butter from day one. And then going forward, I think we don't really have any plans to deploy on other parachains or other L1s, but I think there's some opportunities for, like I said earlier, like cross-chain governance, for example, merging our Kusama and Polkadot deployments right together. So we're looking into that as well.
Yeah, for AstridDAO, I think our primary focus right now is still like bridging the Polkadot native assets from other parachains to Astar and to MintBuy. Right, so we have collaborations with Fala, with Crust, with Clover, with Interlay BTC, and all sorts of like parachains, and we're going to roll it out gradually in the coming month.
Yeah, and not to repeat myself, but we want to bring TVL from Ethereum to .sama. That is our cross-chain strategy, and doing it in a way where we feel like it introduces a security model that we would use ourselves, talking about some of those preventative and detective measures with regards to how the teleportation works. And I think that increasingly you will see assets coming from all different chains, and there'll be solutions that you'll be able to utilize just as projects inherently become cross-chain in nature.
Cool. So, on a different note, like another question that I have is essentially, why do we need so many decentralized stablecoins? Basically, like, and how do you differentiate like which one is better? And isn't this at the end of the day like a winner-take-all market? And it's so difficult when you have a decentralized stablecoin, essentially, to keep the liquidity for this coin, like keep the peg, like et cetera. It's an entire job of its own to manage. And so, how do you see this playing out? Well, right now in the ecosystem, I think like everyone here has like a decentralized stablecoin. There's many more. Like, what does stablecoin consolidation look like, and like how do you see this shaping up?
We're probably the only one here that doesn't have a decentralized stablecoin, but I've paid attention to the space for a long time, and I have definitely seen the evolution of like stablecoin design from like MakerDAO and DAI in the early days to like newer collateralized stablecoins like Liquidity, which I really like their model, and also Frax, which is also a pretty impressive team. It's under collateralized, but I really like some of the open market operations that Frax does. Really, it's pretty critical to them holding pegs so well. And so I think that to answer the question of why, I think there's going to be a lot of innovation in this space. There has been just in the last few years, and like the mechanism design we have today for algorithmic stablecoins maybe isn't the best one out there. And so, I look at it kind of like evolution, like may the best stablecoin win or whatever.
Cool.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, I actually kind of disagree with Luke. I think that right now the reality is that USDC and USDT have a lion's share of the market, and I think increasingly what you'll see are decentralized alternatives like ours taking market share from those centralized ones, and that's really for three reasons. The first is that if you use USDC, like Circle doesn't pay you. Like you get no value share whatsoever. There's also the flexibility to have different collateralization profiles, and you have an opportunity to develop kind of unique utility in connection with just being a DAO or being a decentralized project. And in terms of consolidation, what I think you'll see like stacking. So like you could have D prime potentially on Astar, which is collateralized by Buy, for example, or like on Moonbeam, it could be the reverse. And you just ultimately have these stacks, and then just depending on wherever you happen to be in the general ecosystem, there might be one stable coin that's useful for that particular use case, but then, there's an equally easy way to sort of flip it out and go to sort of the underlying collateral if so desired to pursue a different opportunity.
Yes, plus one on what Harrison just mentioned, right? If you look at like DAI and some of the dominant decentralized stablecoins in other chains, right? A lot of them are actually backed by some centralized stablecoins, right? So you can actually, like what Harrison mentioned, right? So you can use D prime to mint Buy, or you can use Buy to mint D prime. And the fun part of DeFi is like using DeFi Legos to build whatever you want, right? And I don't see there's a huge risk for like decentralized stablecoin consolidation, right? Because I see like different protocols have different usages, and different protocols have different like focused areas. Like for us, for AstridDAO and Buy, we focus really heavily on high capital efficiency and superb safety, right? So we have the built-in liquidation mechanisms, and we have a stability pool, and all sorts of mechanisms that can guarantee the stable coins fluctuating between 0.995 to 1.01 or something.
That's cool. I wanted to add a little bit more. I definitely agree with you that the shift from centralized stablecoins like USDC and Tether to decentralized stablecoins is going to happen unless there's some like crazy regulatory nonsense that comes down. So I agree with that. And I do think we're just going to see an evolution of mechanism design. Like I love some of the the stability pool and like liquidation pool you guys have in your design, and I think this example of like continuing to improve that mechanism design over time, and like there will, I do agree there will be like lots of them though. It's not like a winner takes all kind of a thing.
And the exciting part, if I can just add, because I've talked about this a lot with Luke, is like this notion of rehypothecation. So like you like deposit an asset in Moonwell, and potentially you can borrow one of our projects, and then you can kind of take that and use it as collateral, and it's the yield generating collateral from Moonwell, and you can kind of then take it to go do something else. So there just becomes this like 1 + 1 = 5 dynamic, where you're just redepositing assets in different areas to pursue different opportunities, get different yield, and take advantage of different economic opportunities.
Yeah, we talked about this a lot over lunch one day, I think, and it was actually kind of fascinating. If you look at TradFi, like every dollar in the TradFi system is rehypothecated like 18 or 20 times. It's really quite insane. And you might think to yourself, like, isn't that what caused like the financial crisis in 2008? And like, isn't that bad? But that's the reality of like how the traditional financial system operates today, and it's what makes the traditional financial system very capital efficient. It's why there's like trillions of dollars floating around, and there's lots of liquidity. And so, love it or hate it, like this is going to be recreated in DeFi, but in a more efficient and transparent way. And that's what I'm excited about, is the fact that now it'll be visible, like, do you have money to back your position, your loan or whatever, right? So I think bringing visibility and transparency into it is kind of what excites me about this future of DeFi.
Great. Yeah, like transparent capital efficiency is definitely like a really interesting thing to talk about. Let's see, wow, we got through a lot of the questions pretty fast. I guess I have another question to you, which would be like, it's a little bit more shocking. I think you've already been through this, but like, how would I break your project? Like, we live in this ecosystem where essentially everything can and will be hacked. And so what is the weakest link, and like, what are you doing to address that?
Yeah, this is a really hard question to answer, because it's like, as a project, you can try to do everything right. Like we had multiple audits on our smart contracts. We have an immunified bug bounty program. We have people on our team that are like security engineers that come from some of the best crypto backgrounds. And so we really hold ourselves to a high standard, but like the reality is that some partner project you integrate with, or some parachain that you might not even, you just have a partnership with, or you just, gets hacked, and now all of a sudden you have that contagion risk in your protocol, right? Like the Nomad hack is a good example of that, or like the AUSD DPEG, right? Like those are good examples of like, you might think you've done everything you can to be secure, and then like something else gets hacked that like impacts you. And so I think all we can do is that as an industry is kind of try to hold ourselves to a higher standard, and basically make sure that, all the code you deploy that handles money, like actually has audits and is as secure as possible, and just try to follow best practices. Bug bounties are super important to have, because I feel like, you want to give the gray hat hackers ability to like maybe get $1 million bug bounty, as opposed to like stealing $10 million from your protocol. And a lot of these gray hats would rather actually take the $1 million legitimate paycheck, as opposed to having to like hide from the police for the rest of their lives or whatever, right? So I think there's ways we can kind of like encourage good behavior, but as an ecosystem, we kind of, since there's so much contagion risk in DeFi, we kind of all have to kind of like rally behind some of these like best practices and standards.
Yeah.
Yeah, +1 on what Luke said. I think having very, very tier 1 audits is definitely must have for your DeFi protocols. For AstridDAO, we have like 3 tier 1 auditing firms to auditing our contracts before we launch it. And second thing is like, you need to be very, very careful about deploying any new things for your project, like adding new collateral assets or having more partnerships with parachains, and be very careful. Third thing is like set up the best alerting and monitoring systems, so you can minimize the loss if ever there is a hack for a protocol. Yeah.
That's a really good point. I think that there'll be increasingly more resources around DevOps, to your point, around like monitoring your protocol and ensuring you have fail-safes in place just to become aware of vulnerabilities. But I also think it's like important to think through, okay, your protocol is taking this risk, and then, just objectively asking yourself, is it worth taking this risk? So like, if you're using Chainlink as an oracle, could Chainlink have some sort of vulnerability or be hacked? Yeah, it could, but like for our team, we would think through, okay, well, if that happened, Chainlink went down, there would probably be a much bigger problem across the ecosystem. That wouldn't just be like that wouldn't have implications just to our project. So perhaps that would be a risk that we would be okay taking, because it's something that would be much bigger than just isolated to our project. But I do think that project teams, it's like these guys have been talking about, like ought to spend a lot of time thinking through where can things go wrong? If I was trying to be a bad actor, what would I try to do? And what are potential mitigants that we can put in place?
Yeah, I wanted to add some more, this is a really good discussion, and there's a lot of things that we can do. Like, I love the idea of adopting DevOps practices because, for example, a lot of the stuff I learned when I was working at Coinbase are good practices to have, having kill switches on everything. Basically, if you see any unexpected activity on chain, being able to immediately pause your protocol, just don't let any new loans happen, just to be able to kind of see what happened, your idea, what you guys do by checking the transaction logs on both the source and the destination chain. Those on that on-chain monitoring and having a pause button, I think is really important. For example, we have the pause guardians, which is a multi-sig on our protocol. And within 20 minutes of the Nomad hack starting, we had paused all new loans because we just didn't know what was happening. And we were just pause everything. And so I think having that, but automating it through software is actually going to lead to a lot better security. And then there's another thing that I think will become really popular, especially when you're bringing low liquidity assets from other parachains in, is having supply caps in your protocol. So that okay, we'll only take $5 million of collateral from this parachain. So that way, if that parachain gets hacked or the app on that parachain gets hacked, you limit the losses to your total protocol to just a small percentage, right?
Yes. Plus one on what Luke said. We need to do extremely careful research about any new collaterals. I think for Moonwell, you also need to add collaterals, right? For us, it's the same thing. We need to add new collaterals from parachain assets. And another thing I want to highlight is never have any single point of failure in your protocol, right? If for example, for Astar, I think we can have multiple oracles to support, so there's a fail-safe alternative oracles for us. Yeah.
Well, okay, I have another question actually that some of your responses from earlier made me think about when we were discussing Wormhole, for example, and insurance funds. Now, this vote about Wormhole in the Moonbeam community was incredibly controversial and contentious. And I think, I don't really know, I don't have an answer for which is the right and wrong way, but just something to kind of think about and get some feedback about, which is there's a reason, people feel very safe about Wormhole because, very famously when it was hacked for $600 million, Jump covered the hole, right? And so we're in this position now, but people, are very concerned about these incredibly rich trading firms having an outside amount of power and influence on these ecosystems because essentially they control these liquidity endpoints, shall you say, of the money flowing in and out of the ecosystem. And they're really the only ones who have deep enough pockets to essentially be able to just cover hacks because they're making enough money on it that it actually makes sense. And you see this a lot of times with another kind of notorious player in this ecosystem like FTX and Alameda. And so what can we do? Right now it's very difficult in this ecosystem because we just need the liquidity, the on and off ramps for the liquidity, and maybe the cost of that in this very nascent time period is this loss of sovereignty and decentralization and having to rely on these very powerful, centralized firms. So what can we do? Is the answer more sovereign insurance funds? What can we do to break free of this?
This is a really tough question to answer because the reality is that Jump Crypto bailed out Wormhole when they got hacked earlier this year, but that may not happen again if they get hacked for $1 billion, right? They may just say hey, we don't have enough to backstop the losses, right? So there is that risk. I think what we're probably going to see is something that we've seen in traditional finance, which is reinsurance of these protocols. And you can actually see there's a couple projects that are already launching. There's one sister portfolio company to ours at Arrington that's called FIDE. They're doing DAO treasury management and helping DAOs to basically diversify their governance token with a basket of other governance tokens, so that if you get hacked, and your governance token drops in value 90%, you actually still have money to help pay off your depositors. But reinsurance, I think, is going to be key because you don't want to be, as a DAO or as a protocol, you don't want to be like holding all of your treasury in your own gov token, because it's going to go to zero if you get hacked. So the idea of like basically diversifying your treasury to include stablecoins and like, DOT and ETH and Bitcoin and other like, blue chip assets in there, I think is gonna be pretty powerful, because then you can actually have a backstop that actually is, you don't want to like sell 90% of your gov token at a 90% loss, right, during an event or during a hack. So I think reinsurance is gonna be a powerful concept. And then also I think it's just gonna take time for the industry to mature and to like there's no FDIC insurance in DeFi, but maybe there should be like a base level of depositor insurance. And maybe there's some like DeFi Alliance that can kind of help create that in the future.
Yeah.
I think on-chain insurance is kind of like an underexplored area. I think there are many teams, talented teams I know that are actually going into this area in the bear market. And I think one of the protocols that's launched on Astar like just in the past few months is called AstridDAO, and they were trying to build the on-chain insurance for all those DeFi protocols. And I like what Luke just mentioned, right? So maybe there needs some alliance to create a pool of fund to help like compensate users if there's any exploits. And I also like what Luke mentioned, right? For the treasuries, I think diversification is the key, right? Your own governance tokens will go to zero, like if there's any exploits happening.
I have to admit, as sitting on this panel, I feel like what we're saying is that DeFi needs to become a bit more like TradFi. And it reminds me of the end of Animal Farm, where it's like the pigs and the humans look at each other and can't tell the difference. That was just my brain.
I got the reference. Yeah, I mean, like we want it to become more like TradFi in the way that like people should have protections and things like that, right? Like there should be things like social recovery for wallets, so that you don't like lose your private keys and you lost your life savings, right? There should be some nice things around like roughing, smoothing off the rough edges. But at the same time, we don't want the like lack of transparency that the traditional financial system has. And I think that's what's key, is like we want transparency. We want to actually know that these like DeFi banks actually hold all the deposits they say they do. And that's the real benefit over like the TradFi system, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think why we can just take the better part from both sides, right?
Yeah, true. And I mean, honestly, part of the fun of the early days of DeFi was definitely the risk, and you kind of, had a social agreement to taking that risk when you used these protocols. So yeah, I guess I don't know. I don't have any other questions. Is there anything else you guys want to talk about?
We could take audience questions.
Yeah, I was thinking that might be really interesting to take see if anyone in the audience had any questions for any of our panelists. Or me, you can ask me a question too.
Yeah, I think the funny thing about like DeFi summer in 2020 was like a lot of us that were kind of playing with experimenting were people that like maybe they were in the Ethereum pre-sale, so they had a bunch of ETH. And it was just like, it's magic internet money. Like if you bought a few $100s worth of ETH in the pre-sale, like all of a sudden you had a lot of magic internet money and you didn't really know what to do with it. Or like you mined a bit, like for me, I mined Bitcoin on my gaming PC, like back in 2011 or something. And so I was like, oh, this magic internet money, now I can like do cool stuff with it. And it was like really fun and experimental. But now like there's actually retail investors coming in that are bringing their hard-earned cash, not their magic internet money that they just farmed on their gaming PC,
exactly.
Right? Like,
it's a really different vibe, because if you do think back to like the early days of DeFi, I mean, it was a bear market. Like Ethereum was like between like $100 and $250. You're basically the early users were people who are already sitting on a lot of ETH. There's nothing to do with it, Then suddenly you can farm comp with like 7x leverage. It's pretty fun. And it becomes like this gamified social thing, And so it is looking at some of the larger disasters and failures in DeFi, around UST and Tether, et cetera, which I think that was like a huge failing of getting, people putting like their retirement, like fiat into these protocols, when it's a lot different when it is your magic internet money, Yeah,
you just think of risks differently, right? Like if it's if you had to work for that money versus just magic internet money, right?
Yeah. And even with what you said further along of like that kind of like, whoops, I think we ran away.
Want to trade?
Yeah. Then that money like flowing into things like NFTs and all of these other like, even back then it's pretty crazy to just be scooping up like some of these like Pepes and CryptoPunks and like et cetera with a really, most of these NFT projects, they didn't have like a roadmap like they do now where they're going to become a game and a metaverse and all that. Like it just was a JPEG, like... So yeah, it's a different type of like risk climate for sure. Oh yes.
Yeah. So another thing I wanted to talk about just briefly is sort of like a different topic, but there's been some healthy discussion I think in like the Moonbeam Penthouse channel and other Telegram channels that I've been in about like, is TVL the metric we should use to measure success of Polkadot? And I think this is a controversial question because obviously we don't have the TVL that some of the other ecosystems have, but and there's also a pretty good argument, I think, that as we look at like this connected contracts or connected chains future, there's going to be, it's more like AWS and less like maybe like JP Morgan or something, right? And like there's going to be more applications that are just like social networks and things like that don't necessarily have like a TVL metric, right? And so like Derek, the founder of Moonbeam, Derek Yu, he mentioned that maybe we should start looking at like block space utilization as a metric of like how useful is a particular app on a parachain, like how much block space is it using? And I thought that was kind of interesting. So I think over time, as like, hopefully Polkadot evolves to be like this AWS of connected contract use cases. And you might be using a mobile app that like gets information or data from like 8 or 10 different parachains. Like I could see that maybe we need new metrics to like measure the success, and maybe like purely like the number of dollars in a protocol, it shouldn't be like the North Star metric but it is like the only metric on DeFi Llama and these sites today, right?
Yeah, actually, I had a question that like I ended up not including about this of like why do we have this obsession with TVL, and isn't even worth it? And in today's market conditions and after everything we've learned from like 3 years of DeFi to incentivize essentially mercenary liquidity with such a large percentage of token supply, like your tokens are like your ammunition, like and like are you just like wasting this all for liquidity that's going to move elsewhere? There's definitely, like I did a podcast about this like a while ago about this like at the kind of like height of like 2021 about the EVM metagame, right? And we saw this like cycling from ecosystem to ecosystem where it was like, like Avalanche gave away like $250 million of like their tokens just across the bridge. And like you see, okay, the TVL like ramps up there. And then like, Andre Cronje on Phantom had a more complex game with like the V33 mechanics to get TVL there, but like it always leaves, it always moves, and like maybe we need to focus on other metrics because it's just not worth it. Like these metrics don't matter.
I think one thing that would be great to see is more people actually using DeFi. I mean, if you look at, I think it was mentioned in one of the panels earlier this morning, like there's really not that many people who use it yet. Even if there's 100 million people in the world that hold crypto, roughly somewhere in that, I don't even think that there's anywhere, I think there's probably less than 1 million people who actually use DeFi. So it would be great to sort of see more active users of these types of protocols as something to do within the ecosystem rather than just hodling only. Not that there's anything wrong with hodling, but just seeing more unique users, so to speak.
Yeah, plus one on what Harrison just said, right? So having like more users onboarding DeFi is definitely like what we all hope, right? And how to measure them, how to measure that activity is hard, right? Because you need to avoid a lot of Sybil attacks, right? People are like, if you are relying on the metrics, people can exploit that, like TVL, right? We all know that there's one guy from Solana community building like 10, 20 protocols and adding up like a billion, like some TVL, right? I think for like a number of active users in the protocol, I think right now the people are in the crypto space are exploring like so bounding token, like account abstractions, all those things, exploring the ID space, which can help us measure that activity.
I think too also like the kind of like there harkens to be like this need for a greater use case for these blockchains, right? Because it's like, we were talking about earlier how like in the early days of DeFi, it was super gamified. You had like food tokens, fair launches, like all of these games. And it also reflected back onto what was happening in the world at the time, which was like most of the world was locked down, and so it was like really fun to like escape into this game that you could play like against people all over the world. Is essentially like an intellectual casino, which was super fun. But like, is that really the end use case of blockchain? Or basically do like all of these chains need a DeFi infrastructure to like make their like quote unquote money useful, where it's like, yeah, you need like a lending protocol, you need some basic primitives, but really it's just so people can transact and actually use these tokens as money for like what is the greater use case like of these chains, be it like, new like social networking, like whatnot. And so I think that that's like one of the things is that like maybe there was too much focus on DeFi as like the end goal when it's just like a needed infrastructure.
So I think it's interesting because I think connecting all these multi-chain environments together is what brings us to, like right now there's like a lending protocol on every L1, right? And there's like Uniswap like DEX on every L1. And like with connected contracts and what's happening now, I think there is the potential that and it sort of reminds me of like the early days of the internet when like literally people weren't really connected. Like if you went to an office, every office had their own dedicated email server, but like now everyone just uses like Google and it's fine. But so I do think there's like some consolidation that can happen there, which can be better. Like there shouldn't be like 30 different like Uniswap forks or like 30 different compound forks. There should probably just be a few like of these cross-chain liquidity protocols, like some of the new stuff that these guys are building that actually like unify liquidity across all these ecosystems. And then I think it can be, it can kind of move away from this like disconnected lands like into like the future internet where everything is sort of connected and like you don't really know or care which like parachain you're on. You're actually using an app that like talks to like 3 or 4 different parachains. I think that I can see that as like the future. Hopefully it doesn't just all consolidate to like 3 big banks like we have in the US, but banks are a necessary part of like financial infrastructure. So I'm kind of biased because we're building a money market protocol. So,
but
totally.
So my question is like, how dependent is Polkadot or are we on the regulation and also TradFi? Because it seems like the use case can come from the business layer. Like we just had an issue with the POS system, like freezing my account. So like how dependent are we? Like there's another route which I would go there if I was.
So I'm not sure I understand.
It's a question more about regulation.
Yeah, regulation on POS systems.
Yeah, like how dependent are we? Like so it seems like we're pretty in as far as the use case. So and it does go back to regulation. It seems like we're going to be like we're so playing their game they already have set up because easy no way into the court of the game. But also coming with more options to be free. Put the addition out there if it makes sense. For the people that's not, they know it exists in the reason why it exists.
Just a reflection on what you just said. I think becoming comfortable with custodying your own assets is like a really powerful concept because, if you are not custodying your own assets, then there's always that potential that like, a centralized organization could take your tokens or take your assets. Whereas I think one of the really overlooked things about what's so incredible about this space is like, if you look at like some of the horrible regimes that have existed in the past, like one of the main reasons people didn't leave is like they couldn't take their assets with them because it was locked up in the local banks or like, they didn't have like a digital form of value. And it's incredible how like, if you memorize 12 words, you can take your wealth anywhere in the entire world. So I think that like self-custody is such an important tool or skill to learn in terms of being able to empower yourself to access the space.
I think too, what you're maybe trying to say too with like the POS systems is like what we just saw recently with Tornado Cash and like essentially the concern that like, these ETH2 validators wouldn't include Tornado Cash transactions like within them and that being a risk of proof of stake systems. And I'd say like, it's kind of like, I think we've been in this technology cycle, like even before, around the very beginning time of like Bitcoin with like, you can even go back to like torrenting and WikiLeaks, et cetera, of essentially like technology, like constantly being slightly like ahead of regulations and people doing certain things to either have their own like personal sovereignty or like disseminate information to the world. And then regulation comes down and like clamps down upon it. And like, but then like there's a new innovation and there's a short window of time, like a freedom in that time. And so I've kind of come to view it as like, there's never going to be this end all like place where you can like escape regulation and like be free, but you have to constantly like iterate and like you get small windows of freedom like within that iteration.
Yeah, the way I kind of think about this is like in America and like the developed world, in America and Europe mostly, people forget about how, because like banks are relatively safe and easy to use. They don't charge that high of fees for most like, wealthy, Europeans or Americans. But the reality is like in most of the developing world, it's a totally different story. And so like, I hear about these use cases where like, a guy that owns a manufacturing plant in Vietnam needs to buy like $1 million worth of raw materials from some other country, and like before they would have had to send the money through their banking system and they would charge like 10% fees, and it might not even end up at the destination because like some corrupt official might steal it or something. But now they can just use like Tether and send the money in like 30 seconds to each other, and it's like really unlocked a lot of like business activity for like the underbanked parts of the world. And I think that's super disruptive, and I don't know like how the developed world and the banking system is going to try to regulate that, but I feel like there's really no stopping that. That manufacturer in Vietnam that buys raw materials with Tether now instead of like wiring money through banks, like that's just super disruptive. And I think that's going to be the future, as opposed to like this sort of world where like Visa can freeze your merchant account and you can't do anything, or like your bank can just decide to take the funds out of your account for some arbitrary reason.
Yeah, I think in the long term, DeFi has to work with regulators. I think regulation, we are still living in this physical world, right? So if we ever want the crypto massive adoption, regulations must come in. And we have, I like what Tamara just mentioned, right? You get little freedom, but the regulations is usually coming late. Right now, I think we are not very heavily regulated still, right? But we foresee like more regulations coming in. We need to deal with it. I think it's a game theory. Like there are 200 countries in the world, right? Every country has their own regulations. I think US is a big player, right? So we are, at least I'm living in the US, so sometimes we need to follow their regulations. So is there like a DeFi lobby? A DeFi lobbies? I think there might be some alliances.
Like Coin Center is a good one that's like kind of advocating, and there are others that are, I think, we probably need to donate more and like become a more powerful voice in politics. And helping to influence. Yeah.
Coin Center is a great example of that. So cool. So we're at time now for the panel. So thank you everybody for coming up and speaking today. It's been a
everyone. Yeah.